August 23, 1945, Honolulu Internment Camp, Oahu, Hawaii. The transport ship's engines fell silent as 847 Japanese prisoners of war stepped onto American soil for the first time, their gaunt faces reflecting 3 years of wartime rationing and the bitter reality of defeat. Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka clutched his meager possessions, a torn photograph of his family and a small wooden Buddha, as American guards directed the column of prisoners through barbed wire gates toward barracks that would become their new home. The Pacific sun beat down mercilessly on men whose uniforms hung loose from bodies that had forgotten the meaning of adequate nutrition. Tanaka had prepared himself for death. Japanese military doctrine taught that capture meant dishonor, worse than dying, and he expected American captors to treat prisoners with the same brutality that Japanese forces had shown to their enemies. The stories whispered among Japanese soldiers described American camps where prisoners starved slowly, forgotten and abandoned until death provided merciful release from suffering. Tanaka walked toward his barracks, convinced that he would never see Japan again, his steps heavy with the resignation of a man approaching his execution. The journey across the Pacific had been a nightmare of uncertainty and fear. Packed into the ship's hold like cargo, the prisoners had subsisted on rice portions so small they provided barely enough calories to sustain consciousness. Many men had collapsed during the voyage, their bodies finally surrendering to malnutrition that had accumulated over months of inadequate rations. Tanaka himself had lost nearly 40 pounds since his capture on Okinawa, his once proud military bearing reduced to the shambling gait of a scarecrow animated by pure willpower. But as the prisoners passed the camp's mess hall, Tanaka stopped in bewilderment. Through open windows, he could see American cooks preparing food in quantities that defied his understanding of wartime reality. Massive kettles steamed with what appeared to be meat stew, while tables groaned under the weight of bread loaves, canned goods, and processed foods that Tanaka had never seen before. The kitchen operated with industrial efficiency that suggested unlimited resources, as if the war that had devastated Japan had never touched American food production. Most shocking of all were the towering stacks of rectangular metal cans marked with the word "Spam," thousands upon thousands of identical containers that represented industrial food production on a scale that seemed impossible. The cans were stacked like building blocks, forming walls of processed meat that could have fed entire Japanese villages for months. The sight challenged everything Tanaka understood about wartime scarcity and resource allocation, suggesting American capabilities that exceeded his wildest imagination. The smell drifting from the kitchen contradicted everything Tanaka knew about prisoner treatment and wartime scarcity. Instead of the thin rice gruel and pickled vegetables that had sustained Japanese forces during the war's final months, American cooks were preparing meals that included meat, potatoes, bread, and quantities of food that would have fed entire Japanese families for weeks. The aroma of cooking food triggered physical responses in Tanaka's malnourished body: salivation, stomach cramping, and dizzy weakness that reminded him how long it had been since his last adequate meal. The abundance was so overwhelming that Tanaka wondered if he was witnessing some elaborate form of psychological torture designed to torment prisoners with food they would never be allowed to eat. Perhaps the Americans intended to display abundance while feeding prisoners starvation rations, creating psychological torment that exceeded physical suffering. The possibility seemed more believable than the alternative, that American industrial capacity could support such generosity toward enemy prisoners while simultaneously fighting a global war. American guards moved among the prisoners with casual efficiency, showing none of the brutality that Japanese propaganda had promised. These men carried themselves with the confident bearing of victors, but their treatment of prisoners remained professional rather than vindictive. They directed prisoner movement without violence, spoke in normal tones rather than screaming orders, and demonstrated organizational competence that reflected systematic preparation rather than improvised cruelty. What would you think if you expected to starve and instead found mountains of food in cans? The surrender of Japan in August 1945 brought an end to a war that had devastated the Japanese archipelago through systematic bombing campaigns and naval blockades that reduced civilian food consumption to starvation levels. By war's end, the average Japanese civilian was surviving on 100 to 200 calories per day, barely enough to sustain basic biological functions, while urban populations had been reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and sawdust mixed with rice to create the illusion of adequate nutrition. The contrast with American abundance would prove more shocking to Japanese prisoners than any military defeat. Japanese military rations during the war's final phase had deteriorated to levels that would have been considered inadequate for peacetime prisoners. Japanese soldiers in the field received daily rations consisting of approximately 600 grams of rice, small amounts of pickled vegetables, and occasional portions of fish or meat, so tiny they provided minimal nutritional value. By 1945, even these meager rations were frequently unavailable as Allied bombing disrupted supply lines and Japanese industrial capacity collapsed under sustained attack from American B-29 superfortresses that operated with impunity over Japanese territory. The traditional Japanese diet was based on rice, fish, vegetables and soy products, with meat consumption extremely limited due to both cultural preferences and economic constraints that reflected Japan's island geography and limited agricultural land. Even in peacetime, the average Japanese citizen consumed less than 50 pounds of meat annually, compared to more than 200 pounds consumed by the average American. This dietary tradition meant that Japanese prisoners encountering American processed foods experienced cultural shock that extended far beyond simple nutritional differences to fundamental questions about food production and consumption patterns. The psychological preparation for capture among Japanese military personnel had been shaped by propaganda that portrayed Americans as barbaric captors who tortured prisoners for entertainment while denying basic human needs, including food and medical care. Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender meant inevitable death through systematic starvation, torture, and humiliation designed to break Japanese spirit and extract military intelligence. This conditioning created expectations of suffering that made generous American treatment psychologically destabilizing for prisoners who had prepared themselves for martyrdom. American food production during World War II had reached levels that exceeded even optimistic pre-war projections, with agricultural and industrial capacity enabling simultaneous support of military forces worldwide, Allied nations through Lend-Lease programs, and domestic civilian consumption that remained substantially above subsistence levels. The scale of American food abundance was so vast that feeding hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners represented minimal strain on overall productive capacity, demonstrating resource advantages that Japanese intelligence had consistently underestimated throughout the conflict. The development of processed foods, like Spam, had revolutionized American military logistics by providing protein sources that could be stored, transported, and prepared under any conditions without refrigeration or special handling. Hormel Foods Corporation produced more than 100 million pounds of Spam annually by 1945, with the vast majority designated for military consumption by American forces and Allied armies worldwide. The industrial efficiency of Spam production enabled mass feeding on scales that traditional food preservation methods could never achieve, representing technological advances that Japanese food production had never approached. American agricultural productivity had been enhanced through mechanization, improved fertilizers, hybrid crop varieties, and farming techniques that enabled unprecedented yields from available farmland. While Japanese agriculture remained largely dependent on hand labor and traditional methods that limited production capacity, American farms employed industrial methods that treated food production as a manufacturing process rather than traditional farming. This technological gap created productivity differences that exceeded Japanese understanding, enabling American abundance that seemed almost magical to prisoners accustomed to scarcity. The logistics networks that supplied American military forces worldwide represented organizational achievements that demonstrated systematic planning and resource allocation on scales that Japanese military planning had never attempted. American supply chains could deliver fresh food to remote Pacific islands, processed rations to combat zones, and abundant supplies to prisoner camps while maintaining civilian food availability that exceeded pre-war levels. This logistical sophistication reflected administrative capabilities that had contributed directly to American military victory. Japanese prisoners of war represented the largest single group of enemy combatants captured by American forces during the Pacific War, with more than 50,000 Japanese military personnel detained in camps throughout the Pacific Theater and continental United States. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive the same food rations as their captors' military forces, which meant that Japanese POWs would experience American military nutrition standards that exceeded anything available to Japanese civilians or military personnel during the war's final phases. American military food doctrine emphasized abundance and variety as essential elements of troop morale and combat effectiveness, recognizing that adequate nutrition directly influenced fighting capability and psychological resilience. Standard American military rations included multiple meat courses, dairy products, fresh vegetables when available, processed foods, and caloric content exceeding 4,000 calories daily for active personnel. This nutritional standard was maintained for prisoners of war, creating situations where captured enemy soldiers received better nutrition than they had experienced during active military service or civilian life in wartime Japan. The psychological impact of food abundance on prisoners who had experienced extended malnutrition was profound and often disturbing to observe. Medical officers noted that Japanese POWs frequently experienced physical illness when first exposed to American rations, their digestive systems unable to process quantities and types of food that their bodies had never encountered. The abundance was so overwhelming that many prisoners initially refused to eat, suspecting that generous rations were poisoned or represented some form of psychological manipulation designed to extract information or break their resistance to interrogation. Japanese cultural concepts of honor and shame created additional psychological barriers to accepting American generosity, as many prisoners believed that eating well while their families starved represented moral betrayal of their homeland and emperor. These cultural conflicts were compounded by language barriers and fundamental misunderstandings about American intentions toward enemy prisoners, creating complex emotional responses to physical abundance that challenged every assumption about captor-prisoner relationships and the nature of American society. American camp administrators quickly recognized that prisoner nutrition had strategic implications beyond simple humanitarian obligations mandated by international law. Well-fed prisoners caused fewer disciplinary problems, provided more reliable intelligence during interrogation, and demonstrated less resistance to camp regulations that simplified administrative burdens. The investment in generous prisoner rations paid dividends in improved camp security and prisoner cooperation that simplified administration while reducing operational costs and security requirements. August 24th, 1945, 17:30 hours. Mess Hall, Honolulu Internment Camp. Corporal Tanaka approached the serving line with the resignation of a man expecting his final meal, clutching a metal tray that seemed impossibly large compared to the rice bowls that had sustained him throughout 3 years of military service. The aluminum tray felt substantial in his hands, its weight suggesting American industrial capacity that could afford to manufacture eating implements that exceeded anything available to Japanese military forces. Behind the serving counter, American cooks ladled food portions that challenged every assumption Tanaka had developed about wartime scarcity and prisoner treatment. The serving line itself represented organizational efficiency that amazed prisoners accustomed to chaotic food distribution systems that reflected Japanese supply shortages and administrative breakdown. American cooks worked with mechanical precision, their movements choreographed through practice that suggested systematic training in mass feeding techniques. Each prisoner received identical portions that reflected standardized procedures rather than arbitrary decisions based on available supplies or personal favoritism that characterized Japanese military food distribution. The first shock came when an American cook placed a thick slice of pink meat on Tanaka's tray, a portion of spam that weighed more than most meals Tanaka had received during the war's final year. The processed meat glistened with fat that represented caloric density beyond anything in Tanaka's experience, while its artificial appearance suggested food production methods that seemed almost magical to a man accustomed to hand-prepared meals based on natural ingredients available through traditional Japanese agriculture and fishing. The spam slice measured approximately 4 inches square and half an inch thick, representing protein content that exceeded Tanaka's total meat consumption during the previous month of military service. The processed meat's uniform texture and consistent color indicated manufacturing processes that eliminated the variability characteristic of natural foods, suggesting industrial control over nutrition that exceeded anything in Japanese food production. The salt content alone represented seasoning abundance that would have been considered extravagant in wartime Japan. Behind Tanaka, fellow prisoner Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto stared at the serving line with undisguised amazement that bordered on disbelief. Yamamoto had spent 2 years fighting on Guadalcanal, where Japanese forces had been reduced to eating grass, tree bark, and leather equipment, while American forces apparently enjoyed unlimited food supplies that enabled sustained combat operations. Now, as a prisoner, Yamamoto was receiving better nutrition than he had experienced as a free soldier defending the empire against Allied invasion. The irony was so profound, it seemed like deliberate mockery designed to demonstrate American superiority through generous treatment that highlighted Japanese inadequacy. Yamamoto had lost 60 pounds during his service on Guadalcanal, his body consuming muscle tissue to maintain basic biological functions, while American forces appeared well-fed and physically strong throughout extended combat operations. The contrast suggested resource advantages that had contributed directly to Japanese strategic defeat. The American cook added mashed potatoes to Tanaka's tray, a food item that Tanaka had never encountered, but which represented carbohydrate abundance that exceeded Japanese rice rations by enormous margins. The white, creamy texture suggested dairy products that had been unavailable in Japan since 1943, while the quantity alone would have fed Tanaka's entire family for multiple days during the worst periods of wartime rationing when civilians survived on grass soup and sawdust bread. The mashed potatoes were followed by green beans that appeared fresh, despite the camp's remote Pacific location, suggesting supply networks that could deliver quality vegetables across thousands of miles of ocean while maintaining nutritional value. The vegetables' appearance indicated agricultural abundance that contrasted sharply with Japanese farming limitations that had required civilians to plant vegetables in public parks and temple grounds to supplement inadequate food production. Additional items appeared on Tanaka's tray with mechanical regularity. White bread that seemed impossibly soft compared to the hard biscuits that had constituted Japanese military rations, butter that represented dairy luxury unknown in wartime Japan, and canned fruit that demonstrated food preservation technology beyond Japanese industrial capabilities. Each addition challenged Tanaka's understanding of wartime resource allocation and the limits of industrial food production. As Tanaka carried his loaded tray to a wooden table shared with 5 other Japanese prisoners, the smell of American food overwhelmed senses that had adapted to subsistence-level nutrition. The processed meat carried odors that were simultaneously appealing and alien, while the abundance of fat and protein triggered physical responses in bodies that had forgotten such nutritional density existed. Several prisoners sat motionless, staring at their trays as if the food might disappear if they looked away or revealed itself as an elaborate hallucination created by extreme hunger. The dining area itself demonstrated American organizational efficiency through its systematic layout and adequate seating that ensured every prisoner received proper dining conditions. Tables were arranged to facilitate supervision while enabling normal eating behavior, reflecting administrative competence that contrasted with Japanese military environments where chaos and improvisation had become standard operating procedures during the war's final phases. Private Ichiro Suzuki, captured on Okinawa just months earlier, attempted his first bite of Spam with visible reluctance that reflected both physical weakness and cultural conditioning. Suzuki had been taught that American food was poisoned with chemicals designed to weaken Japanese racial strength, and he expected the processed meat to taste like medicine or industrial waste that would demonstrate American contempt for Japanese prisoners. Instead, the salt and fat content delivered flavors that his malnourished body craved desperately, creating conflicts between cultural conditioning and biological need that left him confused and slightly nauseated. The eating process became a lesson in American industrial food production that astounded prisoners who had grown up with traditional Japanese cuisine based on seasonal ingredients and minimal processing. The Spam's uniform texture and artificial preservation methods represented manufacturing capabilities that exceeded anything in Japanese food production, while the quantities available suggested resource abundance that challenged fundamental assumptions about wartime economics and the limits of national productive capacity. Other prisoners around the table exhibited similar reactions of amazement, suspicion, and gradual acceptance as they encountered foods that challenged every assumption about prisoner treatment and American capabilities. Some men ate slowly, savoring flavors they had never experienced, while others consumed their portions rapidly, driven by survival instincts developed through extended periods of malnutrition that had reduced them to animal-like responses to food availability. Tanaka found himself unable to finish the portions on his tray, his stomach capacity reduced by months of minimal food intake to levels that couldn't accommodate American serving sizes. The remaining food represented waste that would have been unthinkable in Japan, where every grain of rice was precious and food wastage was considered both criminal and immoral. The psychological impact of being unable to consume available food was almost as overwhelming as the initial shock of abundance. The inability to finish provided portions created additional psychological stress as prisoners struggled with guilt about wasting food while their families starved in Japan. Several men attempted to save uneaten portions for later consumption, only to discover that American camp regulations required disposal of leftover food to prevent spoilage and maintain sanitary conditions. The concept of deliberately discarding edible food challenged Japanese cultural values that treated food conservation as a moral obligation. Other prisoners experienced similar difficulties as their digestive systems struggled to process nutritional richness that exceeded anything they had encountered during military service or civilian life in wartime Japan. Several men became physically ill from consuming foods their bodies couldn't immediately handle, while others forced themselves to eat everything despite discomfort, driven by survival instincts developed during extended periods of malnutrition when any available food had to be consumed immediately. The social dynamics within the prisoner group became complex as some men embraced American food while others maintained resistance based on cultural pride or suspicion about American motives. Arguments developed between prisoners who viewed acceptance of generous rations as survival pragmatism, and those who considered such acceptance a form of cultural betrayal that dishonored their service to the emperor and their families suffering in occupied Japan. American guards observed these prisoner reactions with mixture of amusement and genuine concern, recognizing that many Japanese POWs were experiencing their first adequate nutrition in years. Medical personnel monitored prisoners for signs of refeeding syndrome and other complications that could result from rapid transitions from malnutrition to abundance, while camp administrators documented prisoner responses for intelligence purposes and administrative reports to higher headquarters. As days passed, prisoner attitudes toward American food evolved from suspicion to grudging acceptance to active anticipation of mealtimes that became highlights of daily routine. Men who had initially refused Spam began requesting additional portions, while discussions about American food production methods became common topics of conversation among prisoners who struggled to understand how such abundance was possible during wartime conditions that had devastated Japanese society. The transformation was documented in letters that prisoners were allowed to write to families in Japan, though American censors removed specific details about food abundance to prevent psychological warfare effects on Japanese civilian populations already suffering from severe malnutrition. Even censored communications conveyed amazement at American treatment that contradicted every expectation about prisoner conditions and demonstrated capabilities that exceeded Japanese understanding of American society and industrial capacity. Within weeks, Japanese prisoners had developed sophisticated preferences for different American processed foods, debating the merits of various Spam preparations and expressing disappointment when alternative menu items replaced their preferred processed meat. The psychological conversion was complete. Enemy soldiers had become enthusiastic consumers of American industrial food production, their daily conversations dominated by anticipation of meals and appreciation for abundance they had never imagined possible. The daily routine of abundant meals created new social structures within the prisoner community, with men who had fighting experience sharing tables with others based on food preferences rather than military rank or unit affiliation. American abundance had dissolved traditional hierarchies while creating new forms of community based on shared amazement at their treatment and growing understanding of American capabilities that had contributed to Japanese defeat. Within weeks of their arrival at American camps, Japanese prisoners began writing letters to families in Japan that would profoundly influence Japanese civilian understanding of American capabilities and intentions for generations to come. Despite heavy censorship that removed specific details about food quantities and camp conditions, these communications conveyed amazement at treatment that contradicted every assumption about prisoner conditions and American character. Tanaka wrote to his wife in carefully coded language, "The Americans feed us better than we ate before the war. I cannot understand how they possess such abundance while fighting across the entire world and maintaining their civilian population." The physical transformation of Japanese prisoners was documented through medical examinations that revealed dramatic improvements in health, weight, and psychological condition that exceeded anything predicted by camp medical staff. Prisoners who had arrived malnourished and suffering from deficiency diseases began showing signs of recovery within weeks of exposure to American rations that provided nutritional content far exceeding anything available to Japanese military personnel or civilians during the war's final phases. Camp medical officers noted that Japanese POWs were gaining weight at rates that indicated their previous nutrition had been severely inadequate for extended periods. Medical documentation revealed that many prisoners exhibited symptoms of chronic malnutrition that suggested systematic food shortages throughout Japanese military and civilian systems during the war's final year. Conditions including scurvy, beriberi, and protein deficiency were widespread among newly arrived prisoners, indicating that Japanese forces had been operating under nutritional constraints that would have been considered emergency conditions in American military planning. The contrast highlighted resource advantages that had contributed directly to American military superiority. American intelligence services recognized the propaganda value of well-fed Japanese prisoners and began systematically documenting prisoner responses to American treatment for use in psychological warfare operations and post-war occupation planning. Intelligence reports noted that Japanese POWs expressed consistent amazement at American food abundance, industrial capacity, and organizational efficiency that had enabled generous treatment of enemy personnel while maintaining global military operations and domestic civilian abundance. These testimonies provided valuable insights into Japanese wartime conditions while demonstrating American capabilities to neutral observers and Allied personnel who visited prison camps. Intelligence officers noted that Japanese prisoner testimonies could be more effective than official propaganda in demonstrating American strength and generosity to populations that had been subjected to anti-American propaganda throughout the war period. The cultural impact within Japanese prisoner communities was profound as traditional military hierarchies dissolved under the influence of shared abundance and equal treatment by American captors. Prisoners who had maintained strict military discipline based on rank and unit affiliation began forming social groups based on regional origins, shared interests, and food preferences, rather than military organization that had dominated their previous social interactions. American abundance had created social dynamics that would have been impossible under traditional Japanese military culture. Officers who had maintained authority through control of scarce resources found their positions undermined when American abundance eliminated scarcity that had supported traditional power structures. Enlisted men who had deferred to superior officers based on access to better rations discovered that American treatment provided equal nutrition regardless of military rank, creating democratic social conditions that challenged fundamental assumptions about hierarchy and authority. Japanese prisoners developed sophisticated understanding of American industrial food production through daily exposure to processed foods that represented manufacturing capabilities unknown in Japan during any period of their history. Discussions about spam production methods, American agricultural systems, and food preservation technology became common among prisoners who struggled to comprehend the scale of American industrial capacity that enabled such food abundance during wartime conditions when Japanese industry could barely support basic civilian survival. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate nutrition to fundamental questions about Japanese wartime propaganda and the nature of American society that prisoners had been taught to despise. Prisoners who had been taught that Americans were weak, materialistic, and incapable of sustained sacrifice, discovered that their captors possessed industrial capabilities and organizational efficiency that exceeded anything in Japanese experience. This cognitive dissonance forced painful reconsiderations of assumptions about American character and capabilities that had shaped their understanding of the war and their enemies. American camp administrators documented significant improvements in prisoner behavior and cooperation that correlated directly with generous food rations and humane treatment that exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. Disciplinary problems decreased dramatically as prisoners adapted to camp routines, while intelligence gathering became more productive as prisoners demonstrated increased willingness to cooperate with interrogation procedures that provided information valuable for occupation planning and war crimes investigations. The investment in prisoner nutrition paid dividends in improved camp management and reduced security concerns that enabled smaller guard forces and reduced operational costs. Well-fed prisoners were less likely to attempt escape, more cooperative with camp regulations, and more willing to participate in work programs that contributed to camp self-sufficiency while providing prisoners with meaningful activity that improved psychological adjustment to captivity. The economic implications of feeding Japanese prisoners American standard rations demonstrated the overwhelming scale of American agricultural and industrial production that had enabled victory over enemies who possessed significant advantages in geography, population, and military tradition. The cost of providing generous nutrition to thousands of enemy prisoners represented a tiny fraction of American food production capacity, while the demonstration of abundance created psychological effects that exceeded the immediate humanitarian benefits of adequate nutrition. Japanese family members receiving letters from prisoners began questioning official Japanese government communications about American intentions and capabilities during the occupation period. The contrast between prisoner descriptions of generous treatment and Japanese propaganda about American brutality created credibility problems for Japanese authorities attempting to maintain civilian morale during the difficult transition from war to occupation by forces they had portrayed as barbaric enemies. The cultural exchange that developed through food sharing created unexpected bonds between American guards and Japanese prisoners, with both groups learning about each other's food traditions and cultural practices that broke down stereotypes and prejudices on both sides. These interactions demonstrated that cultural understanding could develop even between former enemies under appropriate conditions that emphasized shared humanity rather than political differences. Allied nations worldwide began requesting information about American prisoner treatment methods that achieved such effective results through generous nutrition and humane conditions that exceeded international legal requirements. British, Australian, and other Allied authorities recognized that American approaches to prisoner management created strategic advantages through demonstrated generosity rather than intimidation or punishment that had characterized prisoner treatment in previous conflicts. The medical documentation of prisoner health improvements provided scientific evidence that Japanese military and civilian populations had suffered systematic malnutrition during the war's final phases that contributed to Japanese surrender and facilitated American occupation operations. American medical officers noted that many prisoners exhibited symptoms of chronic nutritional deficiency that suggested widespread food shortages throughout Japanese military and civilian systems that had weakened Japanese resistance to Allied military operations. American industrial capacity enabled continued generous prisoner treatment without any impact on civilian food consumption or military supply requirements that supported ongoing operations in multiple theaters. The ability to maintain abundant prisoner nutrition while simultaneously supporting military operations worldwide demonstrated resource advantages that Japanese intelligence had consistently underestimated throughout the conflict, contributing to strategic miscalculations that had led to Japanese defeat. The success of American prisoner feeding programs revealed industrial and logistical capabilities that fundamentally transformed post-war understanding of national power and resource management on scales that redefined concepts of modern warfare. By 1945, American food production systems were simultaneously supporting 12 million military personnel worldwide, hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war, millions of Allied civilians through aid programs, and domestic consumption levels that exceeded pre-war standards, while maintaining agricultural exports that supported Allied nations throughout the global conflict. This logistical achievement demonstrated organizational capabilities that redefined concepts of industrial warfare and national capacity for sustained military operations across multiple theaters while maintaining civilian support that enabled continued war production. Japanese prisoners were experiencing the results of resource mobilization that exceeded anything attempted in human history, representing American advantages that had contributed directly to Allied victory through superior logistics rather than simply superior weapons or tactics. American processed food technology, exemplified by products like Spam, represented manufacturing innovations that enabled mass feeding on scales previously impossible in military history while maintaining nutritional standards that supported combat effectiveness under any environmental conditions. The ability to produce, preserve, transport and serve protein-rich foods under any climatic or logistical conditions provided American forces with nutritional advantages that directly contributed to military effectiveness through sustained physical performance and psychological morale. The industrial processes that enabled Spam production demonstrated manufacturing sophistication that exceeded Japanese capabilities in multiple technical areas, including meat processing, chemical preservation, packaging technology, and quality control systems that ensured product consistency across millions of units. Japanese prisoners were consuming products of industrial systems that their nation had never developed, representing technological gaps that had contributed to Japanese strategic disadvantages throughout the Pacific Campaign. The strategic implications of food abundance extended far beyond immediate nutrition to fundamental questions about societal organization and industrial capacity that determined national power in modern warfare. American success in maintaining generous prisoner rations while conducting global military operations demonstrated that democratic societies could achieve resource mobilization that exceeded totalitarian systems despite theoretical disadvantages in centralized planning and resource allocation that had been emphasized in pre-war military thinking. The technological innovations developed for military food production established American leadership in processed food manufacturing that would dominate global markets throughout the post-war period, while providing economic advantages that supported American prosperity for decades. Companies like Hormel, which produced Spam for military consumption, applied wartime production techniques to civilian markets, creating food industry advantages that supported American economic growth while establishing global brand recognition for American food products. The research and development infrastructure created to support military food production led to advances in nutrition science, food preservation technology, and mass feeding techniques that influenced civilian food systems throughout the post-war period, while establishing American leadership in food technology. Military requirements for portable, nutritious, long-lasting foods drove technological advances that improved civilian nutrition while reducing food costs for American consumers and establishing export markets for American food technology. International implications became apparent as allied nations worldwide adopted American methods for prisoner treatment and food production that demonstrated superior approaches to humanitarian obligations and resource management. The success of generous prisoner feeding created diplomatic advantages for the United States while establishing precedents for humanitarian treatment that influenced international law governing prisoner of war conditions and civilian protection during military occupations. American approaches became the standard against which other nations' prisoner treatment was measured, providing diplomatic advantages that extended beyond immediate military considerations to long-term relationships with former enemies and neutral nations. The demonstration of American values through generous treatment of enemy prisoners created positive impressions that facilitated post-war cooperation and reconstruction efforts while establishing American moral leadership in international affairs. The economic analysis of American prisoner feeding revealed cost advantages that amazed military planners accustomed to viewing prisoner care as a burden rather than an investment in strategic objectives. The total cost of feeding Japanese prisoners at American military standards was less than the expense of maintaining equivalent security through guards and surveillance, while the psychological benefits reduced operational costs through improved prisoner cooperation and reduced escape attempts that simplified camp administration. American agricultural productivity had reached levels that enabled simultaneous support of military forces, civilian populations, allied nations, and enemy prisoners without strain on overall food production capacity that continued increasing throughout the war period. The scale of this achievement demonstrated technological and organizational advantages that had contributed directly to American military victory while establishing foundations for post-war economic dominance in agricultural and food processing industries. The lessons learned from prisoner feeding influenced American military doctrine regarding logistics, resource allocation, and the strategic value of demonstrating abundance to enemy populations during military operations and occupation duties. American commanders recognized that generous treatment of prisoners created propaganda advantages that exceeded the costs of generous rations while providing intelligence benefits through improved prisoner cooperation and reduced resistance to interrogation procedures. Post-war interrogations of Japanese military leaders revealed that Japanese intelligence had consistently underestimated American food production capabilities, assuming that American involvement in global warfare would create domestic shortages similar to those experienced in Japan and other nations that had implemented total war economies. The reality of American abundance, while maintaining global military operations, challenged fundamental Japanese assumptions about American industrial capacity and societal resilience that had shaped Japanese strategic planning throughout the conflict. The technological advances developed for military food production established capabilities that would influence American military logistics throughout subsequent conflicts, while providing civilian benefits that improved American nutrition and food security. The expertise gained through feeding millions of military personnel and prisoners under diverse conditions created institutional knowledge that supported American agricultural and food processing leadership throughout the post-war period, while enabling food aid programs that supported American diplomatic objectives. The transformation of Japanese prisoners from men expecting death through starvation to enthusiastic consumers of American abundance demonstrated the power of industrial capacity to reshape not just battlefields, but fundamental perceptions of national character and societal values that would influence international relationships for generations. Prisoners who had been taught that Americans were weak and decadent discovered that their captors possessed resources so vast that feeding enemy soldiers generously represented no burden on American war production, while demonstrating values that contradicted every assumption about American society and intentions. The irony was historically profound and strategically decisive in ways that extended far beyond immediate military considerations to fundamental questions about the sources of national power and the nature of victory in modern warfare. Japanese soldiers who had fought to the death rather than face capture discovered that American prisoner camps provided better nutrition than they had received while serving the emperor, revealing resource advantages that had contributed to Japanese strategic defeat through superior logistics rather than simply superior weapons or tactics. The processed meat that symbolized American industrial efficiency had become more precious to Japanese prisoners than the rice that represented their cultural identity and traditional sustenance, demonstrating how abundance could overcome cultural barriers and political hostilities through the simple human need for adequate nutrition. The psychological impact was enormous as prisoners learned that their captors valued even enemy soldiers as human beings deserving adequate nutrition and humane treatment regardless of their previous actions or political beliefs. The human dimension of this transformation revealed truths about the nature of abundance and its power to overcome cultural barriers and political hostilities that had seemed insurmountable during the war period. Prisoners who had despised America as an enemy discovered through Spam and American rations that their captors viewed even enemy soldiers as human beings deserving adequate nutrition and humane treatment, creating foundations for post-war cooperation that would reshape the Pacific region for decades to come. The strategic implications extended far beyond prisoner camps to fundamental questions about the nature of American power and the sources of national strength that had enabled victory over enemies who possessed significant advantages in geography, population, and military tradition. Japanese prisoners were experiencing firsthand the industrial and agricultural capabilities that had enabled American victory, learning that American strength came not just from weapons and technology, but from abundance that could extend even to enemy prisoners who had fought against American forces throughout the Pacific Campaign. The ultimate testament to American achievement lay in the letters that Japanese prisoners wrote home, describing treatment that contradicted every assumption about American character while demonstrating capabilities that Japanese propaganda had consistently denied throughout the war period. These testimonies would influence Japanese understanding of America for generations, establishing foundations for post-war cooperation based on respect rather than fear, while demonstrating that victory could be achieved through generosity as well as force. Spam fed not just armies, but the very truth of American power that extended beyond military capabilities to include industrial capacity, organizational efficiency, and cultural values that emphasized human dignity even toward former enemies. Stories like this reveal how American abundance became a weapon more powerful than any bomb, proving that generosity could achieve what violence could not. The transformation of enemies into witnesses to American values and capabilities that would support peaceful relationships throughout the post-war period. In the next episode, we'll explore another hidden aspect of American strength that caught enemy forces completely unprepared while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded enemy understanding of American society and industrial capacity. Would you have believed salvation could come from a can? Subscribe now to uncover more hidden stories of World War II.